toward Macbeth and Banquo seem to change during Act 3, Scene 1, as Banquo notices that Macbeth's prophecies from the witches has all been true, and thinks that the prophecy of his son to eventually be king and inherit the throne will be true as well. Because Banquo says all this, Macbeth seems to have Banquo become an enemy, and he thinks that he will threaten his reign to the throne, as he says, "Our fears in Banquo would stick deep, and as royalty of nature begins, that which would be feared."
Thanks, Ryan, for that great input. Now we're going to get into something else very significant that happened in Act 3. We actually see Macbeth and Lady Macbeth illustrate a role reversal. We finally see Macbeth take the lead in maintaining his power and protecting his position. Initially, Lady Macbeth had to devise the plan that got him the king, the plan to kill Duncan, and she had to push him through second thought and hesitance. Now that Macbeth is king and he appreciates this power and wants to maintain it, he doesn't need this second push anymore. He completely devises the plan to kill Banquo to protect his kingship, and he does it independently, and he does it himself without even informing his wife. He actually says, "Be innocent of the knowledge, dearest Chuck," which means she does not need to know because Macbeth believes he has it under control and he can do it himself. He is now independent in his plan to kill Banquo, and this shows that now he has that evil desire, that great passion for power that Lady Macbeth initially has, and now he shows that in his own character.
Macbeth now sees the ghost of Banquo sitting in his chair at the banquet he's hosting at his house. This is immediately after hearing the news that Banquo has officially been killed. Macbeth is the only one that can see the ghost. He even tells the guests that the table is full, when in reality there's a seat open. But Macbeth can see the ghost of Banquo sitting there. Alright, now on to Ryan about Macbeth and Lady Macbeth.
Thanks, Jimmy, for describing that encounter. Now we're going to get into what this encounter reveals about both Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. So as far as Macbeth, he clearly feels guilty for Banquo's murder, and he feels nervous because he knows Fleance is still on the loose and might kill him. If you start hallucinating and seeing things that aren't real, clearly something's bothering you a lot. So he's definitely guilty and nervous. As far as Lady Macbeth, I think it actually shows she's a lot more confident and surer-minded. She makes Macbeth feel like a fool. She has no tolerance for this, and she actually says, "Imposter is the true fear. Would well become a woman's story at a winter's fire, authorized by her grandma, shame itself." She's basically saying Macbeth just sounds like a baby, and he needs to snap out of it and stop feeling sorry for himself. So clearly she's more confident, sure-minded, and she feels better about the situation they're currently in.
Throughout the book, through this point of time, it kind of seems that Lady Macbeth is the one who's kind of carrying the relationship in terms of keeping Macbeth stable and keep motivating him to do some and manipulate him to do some unearthly acts. But when he's starting to lose his mind, Lady Macbeth starts to kind of reel him in. He calls Macbeth a fool and says he's acting like a coward. This shows that in the relationship, Lady Macbeth is the one who's making it stable. Obviously, he's going a little crazy, going a little nuts, because of all the guilt that he's experiencing from these deaths. But it's Lady Macbeth who's trying to keep him stable and keep him focused, on the right path and stuff. And I think she's doing a good job so far.
So now at the beginning of Act 4, Macbeth sees the witches again. Remember that these witches prophesied Macbeth becoming king and Thane of Cawdor, and even prompted Macbeth to kill King Duncan. Needless to say, these witches have controlled his recent decisions. These witches show Macbeth apparitions, or otherwise known as ghosts. The first apparition is described as a head with an armored helmet. This first apparition tells Macbeth to beware of Macduff. Alright, so now on to Ryan about the second apparition. The second apparition soon appears after the first apparition disappears. The witches say that this apparition looks like a bloody child, and they also say that this apparition is far stronger than the first one. The second apparition says, "Be bloody, bold, and resolute, laugh to scorn the power of man, for none of woman born shall harm Macbeth." This apparition is saying that basically Macbeth will never be harmed by a human, and his downfall will be that of a spirit or an otherworldly being. The second apparition saying this to Macbeth makes Macbeth feel like the first apparition was foolish, because the first apparition told Macbeth that he should beware of Macduff, and Macduff would be his downfall. But now the second apparition, who is far stronger than the first, is now saying that Macbeth should have nothing to worry about, especially not worry about Macduff, because Macduff was born by a woman, and if Macbeth has no fears of anything about men born of women, then he shouldn't care about what the first apparition says. So obviously he's being a little skeptical about what these apparitions are saying. But for more on what the third apparition says, I'm dropping it off to Liam.
Thanks, Jimmy and Ryan, for that input. Now we're going to get into the third apparition. So the third apparition appears as a child with a crown. And the first thing that came to mind for me was Banquo's children. As we learned towards the beginning of the story, the witches prophesied that Banquo's children would start a line of royalty, and given that it's a child with a crown, I thought it just matched up perfectly. So initially, this apparition has an empowering message similar to the second, basically saying no one can challenge Macbeth's power and that he's undefeatable by an ordinary man. But then he says, quote, "Macbeth shall never vanquished be until great Birnam Wood to high Dunsane Hill shall come against him." This quote is saying that literally a woods would have to stand up and move for him to be defeated, which, if you take it literally, it does not sound possible at all, which later in the story we will see how it comes true. But literally, no one would think a forest would be able to move. So Macbeth feels relieved because he thinks there's no way this can happen. It's foolish and it's outrageous that a forest of trees could attack and dethrone him.
At the beginning of Act 4, Lady Macduff expresses her anger of Macduff fleeing their home of Scotland. Lady Macduff says that Macduff is a traitor for fleeing Scotland because not only has he left his family without telling them, but he has also left his son fatherless. Macduff's departure was unwarranted to her because she feels that the murder of King Duncan was blamed on his servants. But now that he has vanished to Scotland, he has made himself a suspect. She also feels that he should have stuck around for at least a day or two to figure out who the new king was going to be. But now we're on to Ryan to see whether Lady Macduff was justified in calling Macduff a traitor.
I think Lady Macbeth's reaction to Macduff leaving Scotland and leaving his son fatherless is a justified reaction because he has left his son fatherless and as a coward move. Also, the king has just been murdered and he should be around when they throw in the new king of Scotland. He had, as she says, he had none. His flight was madness. Our actions do not. Our fears do make us traitors. She means that Macduff is making himself look like a suspect in the murder, even if he had nothing to do with it, with him fleeing right after a murder from the king. She also thinks Macduff doesn't love his son, and when he flees them, she relates it to a frail bird and how it would protect its families from those who would try to harm it. I think that you should never leave your son fatherless at all because just like a son looks at his father like it's like a hero and stuff, and looks at it as a supreme role model and learns from it, than really nobody else ever. And I think that if you leave this son by himself, it's going to really damage his life, and even maybe more when he grows up, he's not really going to have that kind of father figure role model that he can learn that especially in his developing years. So I do think that it was a pretty cowardly move by Macbeth as well.
Thanks, Ryan. So in Act 4, we hear Macduff's son has a very interesting perspective on liars and traitors. Specifically, he says, "Then the liars and swearers are fools, for there are liars and swearers enough to beat the honest men and hang them. This is a very interesting quote, and what it makes me think of is questioning conventional wisdom, which we talked about earlier this year. The conventional wisdom would be that liars and swearers are bad and they need to be punished. Obviously, there's a reason for this being conventional wisdom, and it's to create stability and order in society. But really, there's probably enough liars and swearers, as he said, to form a group that's powerful enough to oppose the authority. But that's not what society wants you to think, even though it may be true. And what this reminds me of right now is the people that are opening gyms and opening salons, defying the coronavirus orders and going against social distancing. Because as we know, some people want the economy to get back to where it was and they're not willing to follow the orders. I'm not saying that's right or that's wrong. That's not my place to say. But what I can say is that we have to remember this country is ran by people, and the political leaders can give orders, but if enough people defy those orders, there's literally nothing they can do about it. We have to remember the power is in the masses, no matter what the authority figures say. And I think that's kind of what Macduff's son is saying.
The conclusion of Act 5 obviously sees Macbeth's demise and death, but it first starts off as Macbeth feeling very confident about the battle that's about to ensue on his grounds. He thinks he has nothing to fear from the 10,000 Englishmen that are bearing down his walls, because he listens to the prophecy of no man of woman birth will ever harm him whatsoever, and he takes pride, and he's proud in the banners that he's hanging up, because he feels very confident he's going to win the battle and nothing will ever happen to him. But after Lady Macbeth is assumed to commit suicide off screen because of her madness and sleepwalking, you can tell she's going into a craze. He seems to lose it a little, like right there, and then once he hears that the tree is removed from Dunsinging Hill, he starts to realize that maybe his demise can come, but he doesn't know who from. So he enters the battlefield with all confidence and slays victims left and right, and as he's doing this, he just thinks of the prophecy that no man of woman birth can ever kill him. And then that's until Macduff comes into the battlefield and makes it like a personal journey to battle and duel Macbeth. And as they're dueling, Macbeth says that no man of woman birth can defeat me, and Macduff answers by, he was not a woman birth, he was ripped from his mother's wound, his womb, and Macbeth knows that he's going to be killed by him, but it's something that I got kind of respect, even though all the things that he's done bad, is that he doesn't give up in the fight, and he knows that he shouldn't just kiss the feet of Malcolm, and he knows that if he does that, he's going to be put into rigorous torture and stuff like that, so he fights to the death, and eventually Macduff comes out. He defeats him, and he cuts off his head, and he throws it to Malcolm, which he proclaims as the King of Scotland, and that's how it ends. And Lady Macbeth and Macbeth both die in their own self-inflicted ways.
Thanks, Ryan, for that great description of the conclusion. Now we're going to get into dramatic irony as it relates to the conclusion. So, as the English army is moving through the forest, they gather branches to appear as a forest to disguise their great numbers and their great size, so Macbeth can be caught off guard. And this is dramatic irony because as the reader, we're informed that this is in fact only soldiers with branches in front of them, but Macbeth actually thinks it's a forest moving towards him because that's what it appears like, and he just doesn't know any better. Another way this is dramatic irony is that before Macbeth even sees the forest, we as the reader are informed that the army is gathering the branches. So at that point, you can kind of make the connection that Macbeth was prophesied to die from a forest moving towards him. And obviously, if we know the soldiers are going to have branches, that's what it's going to look like. So at that point, before they even are near the castle, we know that Macbeth is pretty much bound to die because all of the other prophecies have been fulfilled and this one was just basically fulfilled. So we can kind of assume Macbeth is going to die.
Being that everything that the witches said to Macbeth happened, it is clear to see how they were pretty good at predicting. The witches, however, shaped all of Macbeth's decisions. This can be seen when he kills King Duncan after the witches prophesied he would become king. They also prompted him to kill Banquo and attempt at killing his son. Banquo was a friend of Macbeth, and he would never think of killing him. But the witches said that his sons would become kings, and he felt the need to kill them, and also kill Banquo because he feared that Banquo was too smart to not figure out that Macbeth was the one who murdered King Duncan. The witches even prophesied how he would inevitably be defeated, and they were correct in that prediction. The witches ultimately led to the downfall of Macbeth as they prompted him killing King Duncan, and they also prophesied how Macbeth would inevitably die.